NATO foreign ministers are meeting today to discuss how to supply Ukraine with more weapons in the years ahead through a potential fund worth €100 billion. Speaking at the start of the summit was the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg. Here's a little of what he had to say.
We need to shift the dynamics of our support. We must ensure reliable and predictable security assistance to Ukraine for the long haul, so that we rely less on voluntary contributions and more on NATO commitments. We are transforming NATO's comprehensive assistance package into a multi-year program of assistance.
Well, let's talk to Dave Keating now, who's covering this summit for us. And Dave, we understand that during this meeting, NATO foreign ministers are trying to Donald Trump-proof the alliance. By that, I mean put in place measures to protect funding in the event that Trump does win the US election in November. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. That is what NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was referring to there in that sound clip of when he came into the NATO summit this morning, when he talks about shifting the dynamic. What he means there is shifting the coordination of funding from the United States to NATO. This is a controversial move, and it's one that's going to take some time to discuss for sure. The idea here, so far, the United States has been mainly coordinating the funding, and that has largely been done through this contact group within the Ramstein format. So that's something that's actually technically external to NATO and run by the United States. The idea is to transfer all of that within NATO to, as you said, Trump-proof the support for Ukraine. So NATO itself would be coordinating that, not the United States. And what Secretary General Stoltenberg was referring to there when he said that the financing needs to be more predictable and more long-term is, of course, the fact that Republicans in the US Congress have been blocking military aid to Ukraine for several months now at the direction of their candidates for President Donald Trump, and it's unclear whether that funding will ever be unblocked. So this is in response to the short-term blockage of US military aid to Ukraine, but also the long-term fears about Donald Trump being elected president. Of course, he has said that he would end the Ukraine war in one day, and assumedly what he means by that is forcing Ukraine to surrender to Russia and cede territory. The big question about this fund, $100 billion over many years, is, of course, NATO doesn't have its own money. NATO is relying on American money. And if that American money isn't coming, it doesn't matter whether the US is coordinating it or not. The money is not there. The US would still be part of this funding, even if the coordination of it is run through NATO. But without it, the big question is whether European countries can be able to fund Ukraine's defense all on their own. This idea doesn't actually solve that. So we'll see how the reaction is to this today. They're just discussing it today and tomorrow. They'll take a decision on this at the next annual NATO summit, which is happening in July in Washington. That's kind of an awkward location to have a discussion about stripping away authority for this funding away from the United States, because trust in the United States is waning.
Yeah, awkward, but certainly sounds like it'll be a really interesting summit, Dave. Tomorrow will mark, meanwhile, the 75th anniversary since the creation of NATO. Now, NATO was set up to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. We're obviously living in a very different time now. How do you think NATO sees itself in the world today? What kind of threats does it face?
It's certainly an interesting moment for reflection. So we'll have a ceremony here in Brussels marking the actual date of that 75th anniversary. There'll be a larger commemoration in July at that Washington summit of NATO leaders. But what we'll see tomorrow, I'm sure, is a big wanting to show unity. Of course, NATO is in a very different place than it was just 3 years ago, or just a couple of years ago when French President Emmanuel Macron observed that it was brain dead. Russia's invasion of Ukraine gave NATO a new lease on life, a new raison d'etre, and really put to rest a lot of the questions that were asked in the 1990s about why it still exists if the Cold War is over. Now it seems like the Cold War is back. NATO is very much back, but at the same time, as we were just talking about, it's being very much challenged by skeptics such as Donald Trump. And we know that if Donald Trump is elected, it could really spell curtains for NATO, even if the United States was still technically in NATO. If they had effectively disengaged from it, it could very easily collapse. So we're in this strange moment at the 75th anniversary where it's kind of more needed and more recognized than ever, but also more under threat than we've seen in the past decades.